When Jeff asked if I'd be willing to give a message, I picked this Sunday. It's less than 2 weeks until Christmas, and so I thought I would focus in on a couple of passages of some verses that are often quoted around this time, around the Christmas story. Not to take the place of a Christmas Eve message or something, but to just take a little closer look at what was going on when the Lord gave a message of a Messiah, of a baby who would be born, of a son who would be given to us. I had no idea, of course, that this would also be a message given in the context of a loss of somebody's life, a young child. I hope it will be something of some value in both contexts, where we can look forward to Christmas, but see in Christmas the promise of life and hope, even in times of darkness, even in times of discouragement, despair. When I've spoken at different times, I've gotten different contexts or comments from people of, we're going to get some history or whatever, and I thought, well, why change now? If you like history, you can enjoy it. If you don't, you can grieve and mourn or whatever. But I know in my own time, if I get a little bit of history and think about it and study it a little bit, sometimes it makes a passage come alive, or it brings a message home to me a little more vividly. So that's what I'm going to do this morning. We're going to focus a good deal on some history and what was going on when the prophet Isaiah gave some messages of a Messiah. Messages that often are quoted here during the Christmas time here. Isaiah was a prophet. Actually, of all the prophets in the Old Testament, Isaiah has more prophecies of the Messiah than any other single prophet. Now, there's some other very significant prophecies that others had, such as Micah and David and others, but he has more prophecies than any other single prophet. He ministered for a substantial period of time during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Uzziah and Jotham, and then Hezekiah were all godly kings. But stuck in the middle there is a guy named Ahaz. We're going to talk a good deal about him, or I'll be talking a good deal about him. He was not a good king. He was a very wicked king. Isaiah ministered from about 739 to 681 BC. Now, this is Jewish tradition. We don't know for a fact, but at least according to some Jewish tradition, Isaiah may have been sawn in two, martyred under the evil king Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah. We don't know that for a fact, but when the author of Hebrews in Hebrews 11 was writing about those who suffered for their faith, and he refers, there's a phrase in there, they were sawn in two. He may have been alluding to Isaiah. Again, we don't know that with absolute certainty. But Isaiah has a couple of prophecies that are often quoted in the context of Christmas. And we have here from Isaiah 7:14, "Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son. She will call his name Emmanuel." Of course, that is expressly quoted by the angel in the dream to Joseph when he learns that Mary is pregnant, and he's trying to figure out what to do about this. That's specifically quoted with respect to Jesus. Then he also has this passage that we often, even we have songs to, "For unto us a child is born, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace." We're going to take a look now at historically what was going on when Isaiah gave these prophecies, when the Lord gave him this insight of a Messiah who would come, of a son who would be born, of a mighty God, a wonderful counselor, a Prince of Peace. What was going on? And so the historical backdrop, it's going to be focused primarily on 733 BC. And we aren't going to have time to read everything, but for your reference point, these chapters, 2 Kings chapter 16, 2 Chronicles 28, and Isaiah chapters 7 through 12 provide the general historical context. For the sake of time, we're not going to read all of those. I'm just going to give you, we're going to read portions here and there. But if you want to do a little more in-depth study, that'll give you a little more of the complete story of what was going on in this time, in this place. Isaiah chapters 7 through 12 is sometimes called the book of Emmanuel. It's got some prophecies of Jesus. It's prophecies of both of times of judgment, but prophecies of also a coming Redeemer, of redemption that God would bring out of that. During this time, we have a kingdom called Assyria that's ascendant. That's the dominant power in the region. And they're under the king of a guy by the name of King Tiglath-Pileser, if I pronounced that correctly. This is roughly the area from what we now would know as Syria, Iraq, Iran. It's a fairly significant area, a very strong and powerful nation at the time. And Assyria demanded tribute from other nations. Basically, they would conquer a nation and they would demand tribute, a tax, basically, and they would toll a very heavy tax on those nations sometimes. If you resisted, then they would just destroy and just transplant you and pull you away. That's the way it worked back then. If you would submit to their reign, they'd tax you, but they'd leave you in place. If you rebelled, if you refused, if you tried to fight and you didn't win, your nation would be transported away. That's the way it worked in that context. Okay, we've got Assyria. We've got another kingdom. It's king of Aram, or the Arameans. That's a King Rezin. He's opposed to Assyria. Got another king. That's the northern kingdom of Israel. You remember Israel was united under David's reign and Solomon's reign, and then was divided after that. There's the northern kingdom of Israel. Pekah is one of the wicked kings of Israel. He came to power by assassinating his predecessor, Pekahiah. So we had some bad players on the scene. This gives just kind of a little bit of a little bit of a map here to show a little bit. We've got Assyria up above. There's Aram. The head of Aram is Damascus. You'll see a number 732. That's referring to 732 BC, 1 year later. That's when Damascus falls to Assyria. Now, that hasn't happened yet during the time of what we're talking about. There's Samaria. There's a number 722. That's when Samaria would fall finally to Assyria and be taken away. We have Jerusalem to the south. I'll note that to the north of Samaria, up around the Sea of Galilee, it doesn't really show up on this map, the northern part of Israel, Zebulun and Naphtali, the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali settled there. They're already taken into captivity at this point by Assyria. The other parts of Israel are still in place, but the northern parts that include Zebulun and Naphtali, or the Galilean area, have been taken captive. I'm noting that on purpose because I'm going to refer back to that in a little bit. Okay, we've got, as I said, King Ahaz, the king of Judah at this time. He was a very wicked king. He was probably, well, I don't think probably, he was one of the worst kings. If he was exceeded in wickedness, it was probably only by his grandson Manasseh. A very cruel man. He became king at the age of 20, the ripe old age of 20. He reigned only 16 years. The Bible tells us he made his son pass through fire. And scholars have done some debate. Does that mean he actually had child sacrifice? Does it just kind of bring him through the fire and kept him alive? There may be some room to debate, but in my research, it looks like that probably was child sacrifice, something that God expressly prohibited in the book of Leviticus as an abomination. We have our abortion today. They had their child sacrificed to Moloch then, and it was a detestable practice. He sacrificed to Baals and other idols. Rather than worshiping the Lord, he worshiped any number of other idols. Later on, and this would actually happen after the years we're talking about, but to give you a further idea, he worshiped the gods of Damascus. He would be defeated by Aram and Assyria, so he thought, well, maybe I should start worshiping these other gods. And he actually saw a type of an idolatrous altar in Damascus, had one built, put in the temple of Solomon and replaced. He desecrated the temple, the furnishings that were intended to be dedicated to the worship of the Lord. And according to 2 Chronicles, he actually, at one point, he eventually closed the temple for worship. So this is a bad guy. He is not following the Lord. He's a wicked king. So 733 BC, Judah is threatened by several nations, by Assyria, by Israel, and by Aram. And as Israel and Aram are basically in an alliance against Assyria. And as I mentioned, Assyria already has taken parts of the northern parts of Israel captive. That's going to show up in one of the prophecies a little later, in that particular area. So I'm going to pick up then at Isaiah chapter 7 and read a couple of verses. Now it came about in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not conquer it. When it was reported to the house of David, saying, the Arameans have camped in Ephraim, his heart and the hearts of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake with the wind. So there's a war going on, and it's possible that Aram and Israel are coming against Judah because they're saying, Ahaz, come join us in our alliance against Assyria. That's not entirely clear, but there's some commentators think that's perhaps the reason they were going against Judah. And what I just read, as well as the parallel passage in 2 Kings 16, tells us they attacked Judah, but they didn't conquer it. Okay, so Ahaz has not surrendered to them. However, if you read the parallel passage of 2 Chronicles chapter 28, that tells us that Rezin, the king of Aram, took one of the cities by the Red Sea and removed all Judeans from it. 2 Chronicles 28 tells us that in a battle between Israel and Judah in one day, Judah's lost 120,000 men. One day of battle, it says 120,000 Judeans are slaughtered. You know, we even mourn with war, you know, in the thousands that it can be. Typically for us, it's over a span of months and years. This is one day of battle. And furthermore, 2 Chronicles 28 also tells us that Israel took 200,000 women and children captive and they were going to take them captive into their own country. Although some prophets came and confronted the Israelites who were doing that and made them return. And they did return. But suffice it to say, even if Ahaz did not surrender, he and all of Judah are in a very weakened state. I mean, they got some serious problems here, you know, militarily. And Aram and Israel are continuing to press the war against Judah. And the Bible tells us that, you know, they're afraid. And, you know, looking at things in the natural, they've got plenty to be afraid about. You just lost 120,000 warriors. You are in a very weakened state. And they're struggling to figure out what to do. So, in that context, we have a merciful God who reaches out to Ahaz. And I'm going to pick back up here in Isaiah chapter 7 at verse 3. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, go now to meet Ahaz, you and your son, Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and say to him, take care and be calm. Have no fear, and do not be faint-hearted because of these two stubs of smoldering firebrands, on account of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. Because Aram with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has planned evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrorize it, and make for ourselves a breach in its walls, and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Now within another 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered, so that it is no longer a people. and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you will not believe, you will surely not last. Okay. Through Isaiah, as I mentioned, Ahaz is a wicked king. He's worshiping the idols. He's not following the Lord. But through Isaiah, God instructs Isaiah to take his own son, and his son's got a name that basically means a remnant shall return. They would sometimes give their children names that had a special meaning. Isaiah's holding his son, saying, there's a remnant that's going to return. And he goes to Ahaz, who's afraid. He and the whole country are afraid. They are threatened by Aram, by Israel. Aram and Israel want to come. They want to take away Ahaz. They want to substitute their own king in his place. And the Lord is reaching out to them, and he says, don't be afraid of Aram. Don't be afraid of Israel. He describes them as like two stubs of smoldering firebrands. In man's eyes, they were powerful. In God's eyes, they were nothing. In God's eyes, they were nothing. So even though Ahaz was a very wicked man, he was following idolatry and other pagan nations, there's a God in his mercy who reached out to him, who said, don't be afraid of them. Turn to me. You know, though Aram and Israel seemed much more powerful than Judah, their strength was nothing from God's perspective. And God foresaw that they would be snuffed out. As I mentioned, within 1 year after this, Damascus would be taken over by Assyria. Samaria, some years later, would also fall to Samaria would later fall to Assyria as well. God governs the nations. He governs and rules. And God's saying, don't worry about them. Don't turn to Assyria. Turn to me, in essence, is what he's saying. And God continues to reach out, and he says, you need to trust me, though. If you don't believe, you surely will not last. The Lord demands our trust. We do need to turn to him. We do need to put our faith in him. We need to put our trust in him for his redemption. He calls us to turn to him. It's not just kind of giving lip service. We have to really turn to him. And then in Isaiah 7, picking up at verse 10, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz. Ask for a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. You know, that's an amazing thing. How many of you have had the Lord say, ask for a sign for me as to whether my word is true, whether my promise is true? God in his mercy is reaching out to a wicked man saying, turn to me. Trust me. Ask for a sign. I'll give it to you. I want you to trust me, not Assyria. And, God from time to time would do that. He would give Ahaz's son, Hezekiah, a sign where the sun would actually go backwards as a confirmation that Hezekiah would be healed. Something as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. He said, it doesn't have to be a little thing. It can be as big as you want. Think big. A merciful God, again, reaching out to a wicked king. God would have all men to be saved. That all would come to the knowledge of the truth, right? I sure have to remind myself of that because there's a whole lot of people I see in the world or that I deal with in work or wherever that I just want to just say, Lord, just nuke them, But I need to remember that's not my place. It's hard sometimes, but I have to remember God is the judge. In the final analysis, he would have all turn to him in repentance. So God reaches out. The Lord demands our trust. But what do we get from Ahaz? Tragically, Ahaz has a superficial response. He says, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Okay? He is not really expressing trust in God. He's not really expressing faith in God. It's a false piety. Oh, no, I wouldn't want to do that. Do we have that today? Do we have leaders who may give a false piety, a condescension toward religion, but in reality, They're really not following the Lord. Well, God isn't fooled or impressed by that kind of a superficial piety. He's not impressed by that. And so the Lord responds. He says, well, okay, then I'm going to give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. That's the context where this verse comes from. The Lord reaching to a merciful, in a merciful way to calling someone to himself. He says, well, then I'm going to give you a sign. There's going to be a virgin who's going to bear a son, and she's going to call him Emmanuel. And what does Emmanuel mean? God with us. God promised a son who would be God with us. Now, there's probably a double fulfillment. Some of the prophecies have kind of a double fulfillment. There's some debate among scholars, okay, what son in that immediate context was Isaiah talking about? Was the Lord talking about through him? Isaiah had a child, and I don't know if he was a baby or just a toddler at this point. This prophecy goes on to say that, this child would not be very old before, Damascus would be gone. Or whether it was perhaps a child of Ahaz or whatever. But we also know this God, the Lord, fulfilled this prophecy when Jesus was conceived in the Virgin Mary. In the midst of that time of darkness, we see the Lord giving a promise that there's going to be a day of redemption coming. Even when the wicked don't turn to the Lord, when they reject God's mercy, I'm going to give a son, and he's going to be with us. He will walk with you, and he will be with you. And tragically, when you read Isaiah 7 through 12, a good portion of it speaks of destruction and devastation that was going to come. The Lord knew that that Ahaz would rely on Assyria instead of turning to the Lord. Ahaz acted out of expediency. Rather than seeking the Lord, rather than doing what was right in God's eyes, he relied on man. And again, we won't have time to read it all, but if you pick up chapter 7 of Isaiah 17 and following into chapter 8, it's ugly. There's speak of devastation and destruction that's going to come. And you know what happened? Whoops, I pushed the wrong button. Okay, what did I do? There we go. All right. Ahaz foretells how there would be devastation, and Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, did help Ahaz briefly. The Bible tells us that didn't last long, and he would turn on Judah, and Judah basically would become a vassal state of Assyria. Ahaz would have to pay tribute to Assyria, and basically, was not the powerful kingdom that it once was. In the midst of prophecy of the coming devastation, there's another prophecy that the Lord gave, and it's one that we started to read earlier, and we see it during this time of the year. There will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. You shall multiply the nation. You shall increase their gladness. They will be glad in your presence, as with the gladness of harvest, as when men rejoice when they divide the spoil. In a dark time of the history for Israel and Judah, the Lord promised there's going to be a light that's going to come. I specifically pointed out Naphtali and Zebulun had already been taken captive by Assyria. Their people are being transplanted and pulled away. It's a dark time. It would be more than 7 centuries before this prophecy is fulfilled. But God still promised hope in a time of despair. And God's promise through Isaiah was fulfilled when Jesus Christ settled in Galilee and began his ministry after he was tempted. God was faithful to bring a promise of light to a land that at that time was in the midst of devastation. And, that's applied in Matthew 4, 12 through 16. But wait, there's more. In the midst of the devastation, there was a promise of a son who would bring redemption. Isaiah 9, 6 through 7. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. In the midst of all the predictions and foretelling, here's what's going to happen when you turn to Assyria. Here's what Assyria is going to do. Here's what's going to happen to my people, to Israel, to Judah. God promised a son who would reign with his government. He promised a son whose reign would never end. He promised a son whose reign would ever increase and who would bring never-ending peace, real peace, genuine peace. God promised a wonderful counselor, somebody that we could turn to in times of uncertainty and upheaval and confusion. He would be a mighty God, not a mere man. He would be all-powerful. God promised an eternal Father, a creator and a provider. God promised a Prince of Peace, somebody who would be a source of rest and calm in the face of fear and tempest. As I said, they were facing a time of fear, and humanly speaking, they had things to be afraid about. Pastor Dennis gave a couple messages discussing anxiety and the sin of anxiety. Humanly speaking, they had some things to be anxious about. But God had an answer to that by finding peace in the Lord, putting their trust in him. So he spoke of an eternal and ever-growing reign. His government, his reign will continually grow. His peace will continually expand. And he's going to make it right one day. He's going to bring justice and righteousness that will last forever. There was light in the times of darkness. In the times of darkness for both Israel and Judah, God promised a light that would bring redemption and justice, a Messiah